Will Israel's next stage of the war backfire? As the Israeli army continues to target civilian infrastructures ahead of a ground invasion, many fear that the attacks are likely to embroil more regional forces in the conflict, increasing the risk of the conflict widening and igniting more anti-Israeli sentiments across the world. Back home, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also feeling the pressure to delay a ground offensive and negotiate the release of Israeli citizens in Hamas's captivity. I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's Newsmaker is Israel. Pressure has intensified in Israel to negotiate the release of more than 220 people held by Hamas in Gaza, with desperate families begging officials to help free their loved ones before an anticipated ground invasion. Can Benjamin Netanyahu sustain the pressure at home and disregard the demands of the families?
Gaza has seen its deadliest nights after Israeli strikes killed 400 Palestinians on Sunday. Heavy bombardments hit the densely populated Jabalia refugee camp and areas close to Al-Shifa and Al-Quds hospitals. Israel has also pounded the southern city of Khan Yunis, where thousands fleeing the fighting in the north have taken refuge.
We were expelled from Gaza City. They said Khan Yunis is a safe area. Now there is no safe space in all of Gaza. The strikes yesterday in Khan Yunis were different than any other night.
The Israeli barrage came after the military announced intensified airstrikes in preparation for a ground invasion. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said the ground offensive will be the last one.
After it, there will be no Hamas. It will take a month, 2 months, 3, but in the end, there will be no Hamas.
Meanwhile, aid convoys have begun to enter Gaza from the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. At least 30 trucks carrying water, food and medical supplies were allowed to cross, but Israel is still blocking fuel from entering Gaza. Those supplies are just a small fraction of what is needed. More than half of Gaza's population has been displaced, and hospitals are struggling to treat the sheer number of casualties.
Before the 7th of October, about 500 trucks were entering Gaza, and they were considered not sufficient to meet all the needs of the population, which was under an unlawful blockade, which had been under an unlawful blockade for 16 years and suffered 5 wars.
The calls for a ceasefire, though, are growing louder. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has added his voice to the chorus.
And now the most important thing is to call for humanitarian support to go into Gaza. We will discuss also about the call for the United Nations about an humanitarian pause, which is also needed even for giving back the hostages.
And internal opposition in Israel is growing too. Hundreds of Israelis, including the families of hostages held by Hamas, protested in Tel Aviv, demanding a ceasefire and the immediate return of their loved ones. They've criticized the Netanyahu government's handling of the crisis.
And we're all here to cry out and reach out to the entire world, to the international community to help us. And we're demanding to bring them back now.
Israel's defense ministry says Hamas is holding 222 people, including foreign nationals. So far, the group has released 2 US citizens following a Qatari mediation. Hamas says it offered to release 2 Israelis for humanitarian reasons, but the Israeli government refused. Benjamin Netanyahu has denied the claim, but that's done nothing to ease the wave of calls for his resignation. On Monday, an Israeli newspaper reported that 3 ministers in Netanyahu's government are contemplating handing in their resignation to hold him accountable for the security failures that led to the Hamas attack. And the cracks continue to grow.
Well, to discuss more, let's go to our panel. Joining me now from Seattle in the US is Ramzy Baroud. He's the editor of the Palestine Chronicle and a senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. And in London is rapper, activist, and the patron of the Palestine solidarity campaign. Kareem, Dennis, Lowkey. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers today. Ramzy, I want to start with you. In contrast to the significant surge in George W. Bush's approval rating from 51% to 90% in the wake of 9/11, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not experienced a similar boost despite the ongoing war. And according to a recent poll of 620 Jewish Israelis conducted at Tel Aviv University, there is a staggering 95% consensus that Hamas's attack was a failure of the Israeli government. What potential long-term consequences might this hold for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli politics?
Thank you. So the issue here in Israel is that this is unusual. This shouldn't be the case. In fact, previous Israeli governments have provoked wars on Gaza, on Lebanon. They have attacked Palestinians in the West Bank as a way to build political support among their various constituencies, whether they are in the right, left, center, it doesn't matter. This time around, it is different. And it is different because the Israeli society was already divided on Benjamin Netanyahu to begin with because of the so-called judicial reforms. And he is just a divisive figure that hasn't really won the support of majority of Israelis in a very long time, one election after the next. The other thing is that he is being accused of being of focusing so much on his politicking in order for him to remain in power, to ensure that he does not face the consequences of his corruption, the various corruption cases that are open at various Israeli courts, solidifying his support amongst the far-right constituency, again, to bolster his chances of remaining in power, to the point that, in their point of view, he has neglected the issue of security altogether. And let's not forget, Israeli society is a war society. Everybody is to be drafted. Everybody is to participate, men, women, everyone else. So if a society of this nature was unable to face what the reports speak of about 1,000 Palestinian fighters entering from a besieged territory like Gaza and putting this much pressure and creating this much damage on Israel, it means that there has been a complete breakdown in the military aspect of Israel and the Israeli establishment. And naturally, they're going to point to the person that they have half of Israeli society has trusted and the other half has mistrusted for a long time. Now all Israelis are turning against him. And that, from their point of view, that does make a very good sense.
And at least from the polls, it looks like the Israeli society is united against Benjamin Netanyahu. Lowkey, considering the protests in Israel demanding Prime Minister Netanyahu to resign, what is your assessment through the political challenges he currently faces, given the sentiments that have been expressed by protesters? And there's also news of some of his ministers contemplating to resign.
Well, you also have to question what was the vulnerability that allowed something like this to happen in the first place. And that was namely not only protesters on the street, but for the better part of a year, the military and intelligence establishment within the political unit of Israel militating against Netanyahu. And I'm not saying that lightly. There was a report which came out that found that David Benaya, the head of Israel's external intelligence agency, had given permission to thousands of employees of that agency to participate in demonstrations against the Netanyahu government. And even the internal intelligence agency, Shin Bet, had permission requested by its employees to join in. And even the former head of Shin Bet, Avi Ditcha, came out and criticized Netanyahu strongly. The mobilization also saw hundreds of military personnel refusing to serve in the occupation forces, not because they are occupation forces, but because of trust in Netanyahu. You saw Israeli diplomats across the world going on strike and closing their embassies. But there's another aspect to this. And I think there is an interesting statement made by Yair Netanyahu, the brat son of Netanyahu, which is somehow instructive. He said the US needs to leave us alone. Ben-Gvir also said that the US needs to understand that Israel is not a star on the US flag. Now, what was found is that one of the key groups militating against the Netanyahu government, the Movement for Quality Government in Israel, was actually been funded directly by the US State Department for the last 3 years. We also saw the documents that were leaked from US intelligence found that, according to information obtained by the United States via signals intelligence, meaning that they are surveilling the electronic communications of Israel's external intelligence in this case, found that actually there had been encouragement from Israel's external intelligence agency, Mossad, of dissent among people against the Netanyahu government. Now, here's an interesting point with where we have come to now, is one of the key figures in trying to get rid of Netanyahu was Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. Now, since the 7th of October, what you've seen is actually these figures be brought in to a coalition war government and the sidelining of figures like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. So actually, Netanyahu has brought in the very people who have been trying to overthrow him for the last year. Will it be enough? I don't think so.
Interesting points there. Ramzy, in the context of the protests and potential ministerial resignation, I think it's quite evident that Benjamin Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure. So how would you analyze the Netanyahu government's ability to handle complex challenges such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the pressing humanitarian crisis in Gaza from a political perspective?
Right. Let's just start with the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I think it's important that we realize that for Netanyahu, this is not a problem, it's an advantage. And this is not an invention of Netanyahu, meaning using humanitarian crisis as a pressure tool against Palestinians. It's been going on for a long time. In fact, the very idea of the Israeli siege on Gaza is by itself a political strategy. I mean, we all remember the reports in Haaretz and other Israeli media leaked about the Israeli army of counting calories. How many calories that Gazans need to consume in order for them not to starve to death, but to remain, as they put it, on a diet. Dov Weissglass, the former advisor to the notorious Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, has made it very clear that the siege on Gaza was a political strategy that aims at completely destroying any chances for the two-state solution and the political process and all the rest in order for them to keep Gaza contained. So what we are seeing is that very strategy that the Israelis have used against Gaza since at least 2007, if not 2006, is being applied in full. And they are trying to pressure Palestinians and their resistance and their political leaderships in order for them to exact political price out of this humanitarian crisis. But his bigger crisis right now is the resistance in Gaza. Let's be honest about this. Israel cannot sustain long-term war. Israel cannot sustain too much damage. They are used to this. We are used to this. Suddenly, the tables have turned, and Israel is unable to achieve a quick victory in Gaza, no matter what the strategy, no matter if they enter from the north, south, or east. Israel will not be able to achieve anything in Gaza without major losses among their soldiers. And the other question is, but what does Israel want to achieve in Gaza? I think Israeli leaders have climbed a tree throughout this whole time, and they are unable to get down because they simply cannot defeat and destroy the resistance, no matter how long they in fact stay in Gaza.
Indeed, and I believe this is primarily why we are seeing a lot of opposition across the world. There have been major protests across the world, in the Middle East, in many Muslim countries across the world. And I mentioned protests, not just voicing opposition against Israeli actions in Gaza, but also protests demanding Netanyahu to resign. Now, those protests are not just limited to Israel. We have seen similar protests happening in the United Kingdom. So, Lowkey, let me ask you, Do you think the protests that are demanding Netanyahu's resignation happening outside Israel, they might do some sort of influence to foreign policies of countries like the United States and the UK? And do you think it may affect Israel's international standing?
I think ultimately what you will see in countries like Britain and the United States is an increase in harsher legislation against those who support Palestinian rights. So in Britain, for example, you are seeing tabled the possibility that waving the Palestinian flag in certain contexts will be seen as somehow outside of the law. The other case is the chanting of "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," calling for the rights of Palestinians inside Palestine. That chant now is coming under scrutiny as possibly being put outside of the law by the Home Secretary Suella Braverman and others in government. But I think there will be two particular crises that will be difficult for Netanyahu to withstand. Those are, number one, the economic paralysis, which will certainly come along with a long protracted war of attrition, which Israel seems likely to fight on at least 2 to 3 fronts, possibly. Now, the 2021 Ma'arakat Sayf al-Quds, the Unity Intifada, saw 60,000 Palestinian construction workers go on strike for 1 day within the political unit of Israel, and that led to a loss of over $40 million in just 1 day. You saw 300 public transport journeys cancelled because Palestinian transport workers went on strike, and that also had economic ramifications. So the economic side, but then the other side, which will be difficult for Netanyahu to withstand, is when more information comes out about the killing of Israeli detainees in Gaza. Because according to the health ministry in Gaza, you've seen 22 Israeli detainees killed in Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. According to Yasmin Porat, who was a witness to what happened at Kibbutz Be'eri, you had Israeli detainees actually killed in crossfire by Israeli military shelling by the Yamam unit. Now, these are considered to be scandalous things within Israeli society, without a doubt.
Right. Now, Lowkey, one of the main themes of our program today is whether or not Netanyahu's next stage of war plan backfire. Now, in a rapidly evolving Middle Eastern landscape, international diplomacy and cooperation are certainly very crucial. How do you assess the role of diplomacy in achieving a lasting solution or perhaps resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and addressing the pressing humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza? Do you think there's still a chance? Do you think Netanyahu can be stopped?
I think the United States, in its full-throated backing for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, which has entailed the cutting off of electricity, of water, of fuel for around 2 weeks, which has entailed the bombing of civilian sites from hospitals to schools to health facilities across the Gaza Strip and residential buildings, will only hasten the US retreat from the region. What we also know is looking at and calculating the amount of money contributed to US congresspeople across the last 30 years, I found that the amount of money that was donated to Democrat congresspeople from Israel lobby groups in the United States was almost double that was donated to Republican Party Congress people. So what you have is an intransigence on the US side, and really that determines the play of diplomacy in the region. What you are seeing is the development of a multipolarity and the sending of Chinese warships to the region. You are also potentially seeing what is an unjust social arrangement becoming less and less sustainable. And these are really the spasms of a dying idea, which is the imposition of Zionism on the Palestinian population. They are attempting to drive millions of Palestinians out of Gaza into the Sinai Desert of Egypt. Now, that is extremely unlikely and close to impossible to achieve. But what Israel will have to do in order to try and meet that objective is visit more and more fascistic violence upon the Palestinian population, not just of Gaza, but also of the West Bank.
Fascinating insights into the topic. Ramzy Baroud, Lowkey, thank you very much for joining us today here on the Newsmakers. And to discuss more about current humanitarian situation in Gaza, Ahmed Bayram joins me from Amman. He is the Middle East media spokesperson at the Norwegian Refugee Council. Ahmed, good to have you here with us on the Newsmakers. Experts, including the United Nations, are warning that Gaza's hospitals are running low on critical medical supplies, including surgical materials and essential medicines, with the death toll and number of injured increasing in Gaza day by day. How do you analyze the immediate healthcare challenges facing the territory, especially considering that, according to some reports, hospitals are performing surgeries with sewing needles and kitchen vinegar as disinfectant?
Thanks for having me, Jaffa. Really good to be with you. I think the healthcare sector in Gaza at the moment, just like the rest of civil services and public sectors, is being collectively punished in this conflict. Obviously, on top of what you've mentioned just now, there's a massive shortage in fuel. I think the number of hospitals that have completely run out of fuel and therefore not functioning is now at 7 or 8. There are hospitals that could follow suit. These hospitals, just for your audience as well, I'm sure you're covering this extensively, but these hospitals are not just acting as hospitals. They are hospitals, they are morgues, they are treatment centers for people. We have seen corridors overflowing with patients, and they are shelters for people who think they can come and seek safety. They are even spaces where children have come to play games with their friends. These, the health sector is at a low point. I have covered Gaza for years, and I haven't seen anything like this. This is why we have been calling for fuel to come to arrive into Gaza as a lifeline for these hospitals.
Indeed, and the pictures coming out of Gaza have sent shockwaves across the world. Now, Ahmed, according to UNICEF, the trucks that entered Gaza right after the reopening of Rafah border crossing, 44,000 bottles of drinking water were brought with them. With Gaza having a population of 2.2 million people, the trucks carried enough water for just 22,000 people for one day. While I truly believe that any sort of aid is really appreciated in Gaza right now, can this level of support really make a significant impact?
No, and that's literally 1% of the population getting hold of a bottle of clean water. This is literally a drop in the ocean of needs at the moment. And this is why we have been calling for this not just to be stepped up, but also sustained, these aid trucks crossing into Gaza. We have seen, it seems like every single aid truck that has to make its way into Gaza has to be negotiated over by Israel, and obviously the parties trying to convince Israel that this is a lifeline. I think Israel is holding a lot of leverage over this, and this is why international pressure has to be exercised here. We have seen some statements recently, not a lot of mention of aid trucks and of aid and sustainability of aid. We only hear that from obviously international organizations, the UN, and aid agencies on the ground. I think what needs to happen now is that, first of all, we need, and there are lots of consignments waiting to cross into Gaza. This needs to be stepped up. We're talking about 100 trucks that are needed per day to get anywhere near sustaining these needs and satisfying these needs. That's one. Number two is that this aid crossing into Gaza is only making its way towards the south, which increases the pressure on the people in the north. That is something that has not been covered well enough. Third point here is we need protection for aid workers in order for them to be able to provide that aid.
Ahmed Bayram, thank you very much for joining us today here on the Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on X and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.